In this video, we're going to talk about some central considerations for assessments, focused on the concepts of validity and reliability. It's important as we think about assessing all students, but especially multilingual learners, that we consider some core principles. And I think that this quote from Margot Gottlieb's book really embodies what we should be considering. She argues that reliable, valid, and meaningful assessment data gathered from multiple sources and perspectives allow us to accrue evidence over time to make informed educational decisions. So in this video, we're going to unpack what that means for something to be reliable and valid. And certainly it's important to think about how the assessments that we use with students are meaningful for the students themselves, but also meaningful for us as educators as we interpret what the assessment is telling us. And that we gather this information from multiple sources and perspectives, because it is important that we don't just take one indicator of student progress or success, but that we look across many different sources and give students different opportunities to show us what they know as we make educational decisions. I find these three questions to be helpful as we think about assessments. So as you think about both standardized and kind of everyday assessments you use, it's important to be reflective about why they're used. So what is the purpose? Is it to inform your everyday instruction with the learner? Is it a high stakes assessment that might determine whether or not a student passes from third grade to fourth grade or graduates from high school? So why are they being used? What information can be obtained from them? So what can we learn from the assessment, and also what can't we learn? So thinking about, what are we getting from this assessment that can help us move forward with the learner? And then, yes, this third question, how will this information help improve instruction and learning? And I think that's a really important question that, especially with standardized tests, can often feel a little bit removed. So what can I do with this information to better support and teach the student? So as we think about all assessments this week, keeping those guiding questions as a framework is really helpful. All right, so let's talk specifically about these two concepts. So first, reliability. Reliability is a term that refers to the consistency of somebody's responses to an assessment. Or as Adetta and colleagues define it, the power of an assessment to gather consistent evidence of skills, regardless of the examiner, time, place, or other variables related to its administration. So in essence, if I were to test a student today and then test them tomorrow, would the scores be similar? So are the conditions such that the student would likely perform in a similar range, right? It might not be exactly the same score, but if they received the same test, they would have more or less the same score. So that's one central way that we think about reliability. And so that's part of the reason why with standardized tests, there are so many different rules about really trying to control this space, right? So making sure that a learner can focus, it's not too noisy, has the appropriate amount of time, that the examiner who's giving the test is consistent and is, following the same kind of directions or procedures. There's other ways that reliability is also talked about. So it can also be explored in terms of how consistent test items are across an assessment, which is referred to as internal reliability. So as you move through an assessment, did the items that are testing the same thing, are they consistent in how they're doing that? Or the consistency of two or more different forms of the assessment. So when you have as with many standardized tests, multiple different forms of the assessment, would the same student taking assessment A perform similarly on assessment B? So you're not making one more challenging than the other. So reliability is important. We want to make sure that this gives us some consistent evidence of how somebody would perform. Validity is also a really key concept, especially when we think about assessments for multilingual learners. Validity is defined as the ability of an assessment to accurately measure what it should measure. So are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? And again, in their chapter, define it as ability of an assessment process or product to measure the knowledge or skills it is intended to measure. So validity is often talked about in different ways. One area is as content validity, which means do the items on the test actually measure the target knowledge and skills? And so this is a really important area when we think about multilingual learners, because a central question is, are we measuring content or are we measuring language? And while it can be difficult to separate the two, it's important to make sure that we're not making the language demand so challenging or confusing that we're actually not measuring what the learner can do in terms of the content. So evaluating our assessments or revisiting our assessments to see if we're measuring content or language, or if the goal is content, what are we doing to really support the learner so that they can show us what they can do in content? Or if the goal is language, the same thing. How are we ensuring that they're really able to show us what they can do with language? And of course, related to content validity is their cultural bias. Many times standardized assessments, but all assessments rely upon cultural knowledge that isn't shared. It often comes from middle-class white cultural understandings. And so asking questions about baseball or asking questions about golf in relation to a math question or another content question might include some cultural bias for a student who's not familiar with golf or baseball. So thinking about is the test actually able to show me that the questions and the items on the test are able to show me what the student can do in terms of the content. And then there's also construct validity. How well do the skills required to answer the question or to complete the task reflect the student's knowledge and competencies in this area? Or more, to put it in a more straightforward way, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? So if it's a question that is designed to show that a student understands the procedures of a scientific experiment, but really it's testing their knowledge of vocabulary because of the way that the questions are worded and because it's asking questions about vocabulary, that's not telling me that they understand the scientific method, right? That they can apply that in an experiment. So the construct itself, is it saying it's measuring one thing, but actually measuring something else? So I hope these concepts are helpful. And I think I have one more slide. Yes, I think this is a helpful lens again, just to reinforce this point that so many assessments are really bringing the language and content together in a convoluted way. So as we think about validity, what are we actually testing and how are we ensuring that if our focus is content, we are making it as clear and as possible for a student who is a multilingual learner. The focus is language. How we're making sure that language is really the core of what we're looking at. And of course, there's overlap, right? You see this in between space here. We use language to talk about and to do content and learning. So you can't fully remove the two. But for example, I've seen math questions where students are asked about a rabbit who is jumping, and then the question ends with how many steps did the rabbit hop? So using the verb jump and hop interchangeably seems innocuous, but for a multilingual learner who is still developing their vocabulary, that's confusing, right? So trying to do what we can to make sure that we're really testing what we think we're testing. All right, hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next videos.